Hello everyone and welcome to the Ticker.com's news channel on YouTube. On this channel, we review stock markets and discuss financial news, market trends, and economic data from Wall Street to Global Street. So let's jump in. We begin our review of the global economy with key releases in the US, Europe, China, and Japan, and India. The recovery rally gathered momentum this week after retail sales, jobless claims, and inflation data suggested stable economic growth with low inflation. For the week, the Nasdaq Composite advanced 5% and the S&P 500 index added 3%, the best weekly gain in 9 months. Earlier in the month, a weaker than expected increase in payroll and a rise in weekly jobless claims sparked a global sell-off and pushed indices into correction territory. Market sentiment stabilized after a string of positive economic indicators this week, proving those fears of an economic slowdown to be overblown or unfounded. Consumer price inflation eased to 2.9% in July from 3.0% in June, and the measure of price increase dropped to the lowest level since March 2021. Core inflation, which excludes food and energy prices, slowed for the fourth month in a row to 3.2%. A softer inflation report followed the softer producer price inflation report on Tuesday, raising hopes that the Federal Reserve is more likely to lower rates after the September policy meeting. Retail and food services sales, adjusted for calendar and seasonal factors, but not for inflation, increased from the previous month to 1.1% in July and 2.7% from last year. Retail sales are closely watched to gauge the level and direction of consumer spending, which dictates about 2/3 of the gross domestic product. Across the Atlantic, the Eurozone GDP growth accelerated to 0.6% in the second quarter, but the weakness in Germany overshadowed the slightly better picture in the region. India's consumer price inflation in July dropped to a 5-year low, largely because of higher base in the month a year earlier. China's retail sales rose more than expected and industrial output growth was in line with expectations, but new home prices plunged for the 13th month in a row amid falling demand and rising new supplies. In the US, housing starts and permits dropped to a 4-year low, and UK's second quarter GDP growth slowed to 0.6% following 0.7% increase in the first quarter. Let us review key events in global bond, currency, and commodity markets last week. The yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury rebounded to 4% for the second week in a row after a string of positive economic reports. Crude oil prices in New York fell 2% to below $77 a barrel and declined for the second week in a row following reports of weakening demand from China because of deteriorating economic conditions and more reliance on renewable energy. Natural gas prices in Europe steadied at an 8-month high of 40 euros per megawatt hour for the second week as Russian gas flow continued through Ukraine despite the rising tensions. The euro stabilized near $1.09 after hitting a 7-month high of $1.11 on the worries that the U.S. Federal Reserve's rate cut may be more aggressive than the ECB's dovish outlook. The yen weakened to 148 against the U.S. dollar after Japan's second quarter GDP rose at a faster than expected pace. But traders confirmed that the bets that the BOJ is likely to delay its rate hike towards the end of the year. We now shift our attention to major stock markets in the US, Europe, and Asia. The S&P 500 index and the Nasdaq Composite extended gains for the second week in a row after a string of positive economic data. European markets advanced for the second consecutive week, tracking gains on Wall Street and easing worries of a US economic slowdown. The Nikkei 225 stock average surged most in more than 4 years following the pickup in Japan's economic activities, a pause in the persistent slide in the yen, and the allaying of fears of a U.S. economic slowdown. Hong Kong indices rebounded for the second week in a row after the latest economic updates suggested that the economy is on track to meet the 5% annual growth target. Indian market indices rebounded after consumer price inflation dipped below the RBI's target rate and positive earnings from leading industrial and consumer companies. Let us shift our attention to merger deals, market movers, and earnings update from leading companies last week. Kellanova, the recently spun-off division from Kellogg's, surged 8% after the snack maker agreed to be acquired by Mars, independently held, for $83.50 per share in cash, or a total consideration of $35.9 billion, including debt. Starbucks surged 16% after the coffee chain announced a surprise CEO change, replacing Lakshman Narasimhan with Brian Nicole, the current CEO of Chipotle Mexican Grill. Applied Materials, the maker of Advanced Semiconductor Equipment Company, reported better than expected fiscal third quarter earnings. Home Depot dropped 2%, and the home improvement retailer estimated a larger comparable same-store sales decline in 2024. JD.com jumped 6%, and the Chinese e-commerce platform operator reported net income in the second quarter nearly doubled, despite intense price competition. Bayer soared 11% after the German agrochemical company won a legal victory against the U.S. claims that its Roundup weed killer caused cancer. Cisco Systems jumped 8%, and the networking equipment maker reported better than expected fiscal fourth quarter result. The company also announced to cut 7% of its global workforce. Walmart soared 9%, and the discount retailer reported better than expected revenue and earnings in its latest quarter and lifted its annual estimate on the strength of its first half result. UBS Group jumped 4%, and the Swiss bank reported that second quarter profit jumped to $1.1 billion, sharply ahead of market expectations. Balfour Beatty and the UK construction service provider reported an increase in earnings for the first half. ThyssenKrupp declined after the steelmaker lowered its annual profit estimate for the third time this year. In the U.S., investors are looking for the release of existing home sales at 3.8 million units and new home sales to hover near 0.6 million for July. In Europe, investors are looking forward to the release of construction output, inflation update, and current account balance in the euro area. Inflation is estimated at 2.6% in July, and current account surplus is expected to rise to 25 billion euros. In Japan, in Asia, Japan is set to announce its international exports, imports, and trade balance. Exports are likely to jump 5.4%, and imports are expected to increase by 3.2%. Moreover, Japan's inflation in July is expected to accelerate to 2.8% and core inflation 2.7%. You can review daily U.S. and global financial market news, stock movers, earnings, SEC filings, and economic updates on ticker.com and 123jump.com. You can find the latest financial books on redera.com, keep up with financial industry events on eventsinamerica.com, review ETF and mutual fund performance and in-depth profiles on tickerfunds.com, and review market updates and stock movers in India on niveshak.in. That is all for today, and we will see you next